thank you. And thank you for all the speakers. You've been amazing on timing. We've left with enough time now for good conversation amongst the panel and amongst all of you out there in terms of questions. And I'd like you to, if you can, post your questions in the chat. And I'm going to go to Vanessa first. And Vanessa, could you unmute yourself and ask your question rather than me asking it? So Vanessa Castonbrotto from Sheffield.
Thank you. Congratulations to all the speakers. I really enjoyed this session. So my question was about the impacts of climate action, and also the idea that in a lot of these initiatives, high-end shining projects are privileged, and those projects are not always linked with the more wider interests of the people on the city. I think I'm particularly thinking of your presentations, Simon and Rachel. Is this something that you find, this concern in which the shining example is privileged over actually addressing the Sustainable Development Goals and actually delivering a low carbon city for all? Thank you.
Do you want to go first? You were nodding.
Yeah, nodding vigorously. Yeah, sorry, I can't help it. Thank you. I think that's a really great question. And yes, we do see it as a problem. It can also be used as a kind of helpful lever as well. So pilots, profiles, giving something a bit of shine and prestige can help move it forward. But absolutely, when issues are low visibility, it's really hard to do something about it. And when I looked at your question, I thought immediately of retrofit, and we hear that expressed very directly by cities. I can't get traction for this retrofit policy. It's not tangible. You can't point to it and say, there's my legacy, there's a cycle lane, there's my legacy, there's a park. You can't, you can't sort of see it. And that's a real issue. And so I think in terms of solutions to that, which perhaps wasn't what you were asking so much, but is where there are opportunities, where things do become visible because of events. So COVID, for example, the jobs and the health focus, we're trying to kind of link retrofit into both of those things now. So rather than talking about retrofit for energy efficiency, how can it create jobs? How can it create healthier buildings? Both of which are kind of quite high visibility at the moment. In terms of the equity element, Ben's already helpfully flagged up the inclusive climate action programme we've got. I think equity is super important. One of the speakers, possibly Linda, mentioned that, if climate action can make things worse or better or more equitable, and that's just hugely important in everything we do. And again, just on the recent post-COVID recovery around just transition, and on the theme of visibility, I think we've seen how visible key workers have become, some of whom were just totally invisible before. So there's a window there for us to talk about that, because there's now a moment of visibility. So sorry, there was quite a lot kind of in there and not very well structured, but I totally agree. And I thank you for raising such an important point.
Thank you. Simon, over to you. Are we in danger of doing the shiny stuff and ignoring distributional issues, for example?
I mean, sure. Malmo is a very segregated city, so of course there is that risk. We're trying, for example, with my solar panel initiative, to see if you can tie in job opportunities and to educate unemployed workers to so to say put these solar panels up. That's, I'm just trying to get political majority for that solar panel company anyway, so it's a bit of a stretch, I should say. But when we're looking at climate risk, for example, we're a very flat city, so we need to take into consideration when we have heavy rains and so forth, and we are trying to invest in the areas that are experiencing rougher times, to say how do we deal with these areas. And for example, we can build multifunctional playgrounds that are, lowered, so to say, to be able to take on the rain. At the same time, then you give that part of the city something useful for their citizens. So we're trying to have a focus on that. It's not always easy, but we need to have it. And I think we're always saying in Malmo, it needs to be sustainable from an economic, from an environmental standpoint, and from the social standpoint. So really trying to hammer that in.
Simon, thank you. So Clarice from Cardiff University, really great question on reconciling conflicting objectives. So maybe Ben and Linda could talk to this a little bit. And Clarice, would you would you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, basically, I was interested in seeing, because you talk a lot about engagement of different types of stakeholders, and that includes not only the community, but also the business. And for these two, there is a big issue in terms of reconciling conflicting objectives, and also an issue of decision-making about who does this reconciliation and how. And because you can easily fall into the trap of, if you are a citizen, just disengaging, and if you are a business, just bypassing targets, negotiating them, lobbying, etc. So really, I think we are at the point of no return, and we need more urgent action. And this is a key point on it. And at some stage, somebody needs to make a decision. So who is this somebody? And how do you deal also with unpleasant decisions, because they won't be pleasant for all. So.
Yeah, it's a great question. I have to say, though, that in my experience, I've never sort of really been in a situation where a massive conflict issue has come up in discussion around a particular climate intervention. I guess I'm thinking potentially there might be somewhere in, as we touch on the aviation sector, but most of the time, you bring people together, you hear different perspectives on the types of interventions that they're supporting and the types of things they're doing themselves and the types of things that they therefore want to support. And it's kind of possible to say, okay, here's a set of actions that these actors can take forward. Here's another set that this actors can take forward. I don't know if, Rachel, if you've had any experience with like big conflict issues, but I'm just trying to think of an example of what, where one of these conflicts arise that you ask about in your question.
Yeah. Great. So Linda, you talked a lot about co-benefits, but what about the kind of co-disbenefits?
Absolutely. Thank you, Clarice, for asking that question. I think it's extremely important. And I think the first, or actually the main point that I want to make is I think that we have to recognize that there will be conflict, and maybe that's not a bad thing. These things will not be necessarily always consensual. There is going to be benefits and drawbacks for different groups, and that's just reality of this. And I think that in terms of, if we think, for example, of a climate action plan, it's not like they have just emerged out of a vacuum. They always come from a political context, and that has involved negotiation between different interest groups. We have recently conducted research on the climate emergency declaration, for example, and how they have become integrated into climate plans. And there we see that we have activist movements like Extinction Rebellion, for example. They're fighting very intense battles against, let's say, for example, conservative parties, and obviously they don't agree. But the fact is that in places where we have a democratic context, there will usually be institutional channels where these interests can be weighed against each other. And also it happens, of course, outside of those platforms through protests and so forth. And I think I can think of lots of examples where there is direct frontline. Let's say, for example, waste to energy plants, they will be located in specific places where people don't want them. This traces back to a long history of environmental justice activism, where certain groups will be more likely to be affected by pollution, for example, through this infrastructure investment. And it also operates in much more insidious ways. Let's say, for example, investment into parks or energy retrofits. If those investments are directed into areas where usually, or originally, for example, we had low-income households, they might be displaced through the increase in property values and things like this. So these are obviously linked to urban politics that existed before climate was an issue, and they have to be resolved by political contestation. I think we need to accept that conflict will be part of this.
Ben, very quickly on this.
Yeah, I was just actually reflecting a little bit on my first response. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because whilst I'm saying I've never seen conflict in the climate action planning process, the actions that are described in those plans often then lead to conflict, because I'm thinking about the low traffic neighbourhoods in London at the moment, where we're seeing a number of councils trying to roll out these areas where they're basically closing streets down to cars, and a lot of car users really angry about that. And it's kind of interesting. I think Linda's right. There does need to be like a top level political decision to drive those emissions down, and therefore an assumption that some interventions need to come forward that do that. Then I guess the process, there's maybe a follow-up kind of need for sort of citizen engagement around each individual action like those ones in each place to kind of make sure that it can come forward with the support of the local community. I think it's fascinating at the moment. You've got half of London boroughs introducing these things and supported by the local citizens, and the other half introducing them and really opposed. So yeah, clearly there are some challenges at that level.
Okay, so Simon Power's got a question on how important is place and place-based action to resolve this, and maybe Simon would want to go first on this.
Hi, yeah, it's probably to all of you, but I think it's just indicating, as you started to talk about, the more we understand about consumption-based emissions, the more we understand about the role of the private sector, some of the harder to get at sectors. You know, the sort of narrative we're hearing, particularly in the UK from local authorities, about we're going to be a net zero place by whatever date. You know, is there quite a lot of naivety in those claims? You know, given that perhaps, I don't know whatever the percentage you want to choose, but maybe it's as little as 5% of the local authority's direct emissions, maybe it's 10, 20% the local authority has influence on. So that was just really my question. You know, and does it reflect, I suppose, the lack of real powers of many UK towns and cities? I mean, maybe Ben to start off with, but I'm sure Rachel and others have views.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think it completely varies, right? Because it depends what's happening in that place in the next period. Because in some places there's big growth planned and master plans for whole new, you know, developments that might where the local authority does have a lot of power through planning, through development control, through specific action plans around that place or master plan. But I guess in other places where there isn't such level of growth, then their opportunity to drive down the emissions, as you described, might be slightly weaker. So I would say my answer would be that it would vary between the places. Yeah.
Simon, can cities actually do this with the powers they got?
No, I have to say we're struggling quite a bit with that, because we try to set the goals when it comes to consumption based, and I have to say that we don't have as of now, at least, a good template on how to measure this. It's pretty hard, and I also think many politicians, including me, has a hard time saying, you know, what do we do on a local level to make sure that, you know, whoever doesn't buy all their stuff from China or whatever. It's a rough one, I have to say. We're starting out with trying to say, how do we measure this? And we're saying, okay, is it 11 ton per person? And do we need to get down to one ton per person by 2050 or whatever it is? That's even measuring it for us, at least, is a challenge, I must say. I also just wanted to comment on when it comes to youth base, because I think that was very interesting to hear. How do you engage the youth? And I have a hard time with that too, because we're trying to determine who speaks for the youth. In a segregated city for us, if we go to a certain school, they're going to say one thing. If we go to the other part of the city, they're going to say a different thing. And then we have Extension Rebellion, which I actually, you know, invite in and say, okay, let's talk about what we do, so you get an understanding of it. But then you get feedback, you need to change the global economic system, and that's maybe a tough one for me. So it's hard a little bit to, you know, how do you make sense of the, you know, where the voices from the youth are coming? Sorry for a scattered answer.
Thank you. So conscious of time, Christy makes a very valid point. We're going to talk after lunch about you know, kind of political passion and collaboration, what more cities need to do. If I can, I'm going to save that for then. I'm going to close before lunch. I'm going to ask each of you to just say one thing that really excites you, that you've seen from your work that cities can do. to resolve this and to tackle the climate crisis? Could be anything: technology, institution, political action, whatever. One thing. And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to try and sum up what I've heard of the 6 main lessons that I got from this morning. So first, it was about shoot for the moon, take the challenge, and cities have to aim to do stuff they don't know how to do. The second was about understand the local cultural, social, environmental context. So not every city is the same. You need to build solutions out of that. The third was all about collaboration, the kind of community of stakeholders that are going to need to do this. City administrations cannot do it on their own. Fourthly, it just came up, cities need the power and the money to be able to do this, and we have to understand, and they may need, I think, in many cases, more powers and more money to do this. Fifthly, we may need to reorganize city administration so they can work differently on different issues. City institutions from the 19th and 20th century, how can they work for 21st century problems? And finally, that make it easy for citizens to make the sustainable choices, so enable the good behaviours in the citizens. So that was my 6 lessons from this morning, and I'm going to turn to you and just one sentence each, if you can, on what most excites you, and then we can break for lunch. So I will start with Rachel.
Sorry, just got to unmute. Yeah, so I would say the mayoral task force that came together to look at post-COVID recovery, and as I mentioned in the presentation, really remained committed to climate and justice issues, even in the face of a pandemic, and particularly the way that mayors actively use that agenda to then influence, in Canada, influence national government policy towards the stimulus, and in Europe, influence the EU policy towards the stimulus. So,
brilliant. Ben.
I think there's still a really exciting opportunity to better understand the grassroots ecosystem of people who care about this issue in each city, and then to connect that with the mayors and the international competition. Often when I go to a new city, it takes me 6, 12, 2 years to understand the breadth of people who care about this and who are working in different charities and organizations all over the city. We've got to start describing that better, I think.
Great. Linda.
Yeah, I had a very similar thought, and it also relates to the question of who is responsible for acting, which was raised a moment ago. I think that we used to think of climate change as a monster who was out there, and that governments and international decisions could reach a solution to this. But actually, we're really realizing now that climate change is more about a reckoning with our everyday social lives, and that it is the decision of how we eat, how we clothe, how we move, and all of this that is going to be the solution, which is very frightening, but I also think is empowering in the end. Excellent.
And Simon, finally.
Yeah, I'm actually going to repeat one of the things you said, Peter. I am excited / hopeful to see, if when you make the sustainable choice, the easy choice, what happens to people. They want to do that, and if you make it easy for them, they're certainly going to come through. And we've seen that when it comes to sorting waste, where this has just skyrocketed when we invested in saying, here's paper, glass, trash, technology trash, and so forth. It's been great. So I think if we make those investments, that excites me.
Thank you, Simon. So some really positive notes to end on from. Thank you all to the speakers this morning. You've been wonderful and shared really some excellent material.